back to my journey then, and on the way, getting stuck, getting in that mired state of constantly being reactive and acting to issue after issue, I sort of learned some really hard realizations on the way through. And one of the primary ones was that what had got me here was not what was going to be taking me to where I needed to be. And that making more effort on the same tasks and priorities wasn't going to change my trajectory. And at the time, I was a startup founder with no budget, but tons of enthusiasm. So I pushed through all the issues and did things the brute force way. And I very much don't recommend it. So what I'm going to do is take us through what it is that we hit, why we hit it, and how we can get over it. So the jump from technical leadership to strategic leadership is probably one that quite a few of us are familiar with. But being a great technical leader doesn't automatically make you a great strategic leader. And there's a few reasons for that. One of them is if we compare the other folks in the C-suite, in the executive leadership team, to the people who've come on a typical technical background journey to the CTO role into the C-suite. And one of them is communication. People who come from a sales background, a marketing background, communication is literally part of the rite of passage to get to the C-suite from that route. On storytelling, sales people have a really unfair advantage over everybody else, but the CTO in particular. The way that engineers typically win arguments is point A so that logic A, point B so that logic B, ergo conclusion. Everybody agrees, right? And the problem is that it doesn't take people on this emotional journey, which is how the rest of the C-suite tends to communicate. In addition to which, most of the C-suite talking about decisions will be talking in terms of finance, outcomes, return on investment. And these are not terms that are typically thrown around in the engineering teams, at least not in quite a few of the ones that I've worked with. So what is it that we have that is the challenges in the way from getting to where we are today to where we want to be? And they sort of stack up in this way. So there's the obvious step for going from coding to leading. There is the idea of going from individual solo solutions to delegating your work out to others. And each time we stack on the next one, so going from a tactical approach, working short term and the immediate issues, to the strategic, longer term, longer outcome perspective, there is always this temptation to drop down a level because what we've known before still works. It's still normally more effective to do something ourselves, jump into the code base, have a look at the solution, make the decisions ourselves, than it is to immediately delegate it, hand it to somebody else, trust somebody else, and coach them along the way. And this temptation to not look at the vision, but stick with the execution, to forego the strategy by looking at the tactics, leads to this sort of constant pull downwards and creates what I call the CTO chasm. And it's trying to level up on all four of these aspects and more at the same time, which is what makes the step up from being, even from something like the VP engineering or the director of engineering to the CTO, a member of the C-suite, such a daunting task. So how can we tell that we're stuck? I mentioned before that this phrase of firefighting. So I guess the first question is, who else has this sort of recognition of the symptoms of stagnation? Has anybody got any questions or comments around this one in terms of how they recognize where they were at this point in time?
Yeah, I remember being in that mode, and you just solve the immediate problem, whatever was thrown in front of you, and you couldn't proactively get ahead of the curve, which was the biggest frustration. And I think part of the problem is so many businesses just view tech as being a cost center and not realizing, well, if you spend a little bit of money on tech, you can bring about a lot of great operational efficiency and actually reduce costs. So there was definitely a phase where I was the firefighter and that was it. So, yeah.
Thank you, Peter. Anybody else see something similar to that stage where they felt a little bit stuck and trapped?
Yeah, definitely. Well, I was actually working for a clinical AI startup, but it kind of operated as if it was in 1995. So everything was on-prem, siloed ways of working, and constant firefighting. And you dedicate some time for the developers to write the code or document the code, but then another fire would spring up, and they'd have to jump to that fire and try and grab the hose pipe. But hopefully now with some Gen AI stuff, we can use that tooling to automate or document the code itself.
And that's really funny. Thank you, but Tony. That's because it's very common that we sort of think, oh, there's a new technological innovation coming around the corner that's going to save us. And as an engineer, that's sometimes true. We get a new IDE, a new automation, a new DevOps, a new CI/CD, which will accelerate what we do. As leaders, it's almost the opposite. It adds a new pebble onto the pile of challenges that we have to face. So I think in terms of recognizing that we're there at this point, thank you for all those comments, by the way. So I think there's sort of 3 areas that I tend to see that people get stuck in when CTOs come to me and start looking for help. One is represented by 2 people already: the firefighting mode, the reactive approach, one thing after the next. The other one is getting sucked back down into the technical work, whether it's us that is the bottleneck for decisions, because all decisions go through us, because we're the most senior technical architect, or whether it's on the other side of the CTO role, where we're in the boardroom, in the executive suite. And even though we might be sitting in the room, we're sort of delivering rather than having a full-fledged seat at the table. And so therefore, there's an element of sort of credibility gap there that can sometimes be even perpetuated by our own behavior too. And if you don't proactively step up, you stay stuck in execution, and it ends up this sort of vicious circle. So breaking out of that is a bit tough. And to try and help us figure out where to get out of that, I'm going to introduce 5 different archetypes. It'd be interesting to see at the end, after we've gone through these 5, which of these 5 you actually recognize that you are. But knowing which one you are, or where you're at, which one you're like, will really help you figure out what are the steps to take to get through and past this stage. So let's take them one by one. So the first one is the firefighter CTO. We kind of mentioned this a few times already, but it's this idea that you've planned your week only to see it consumed by urgent issues. It's constantly putting out fires, whether it's a system outage, a major bug, an urgent request from the CEO is another common one. The CTO here is always on the back foot, trapped in basically an endless reactive cycle of problem solving. These CTOs often reach out to me kind of exhausted, actually, and uncertain about how to break out of this cycle and literally to get to the proactive leadership aspect. They often don't even know how to express this challenge either. So it's normally something like frustration, long hours, low influence, and a confusion about what their impact is. I'm going to go through all 5, and I'm going to ask the question which ones people recognize. We'll do a bit of a poll if we can. So the next one is the senior developer turned CTO. Sometimes people describe this as the accidental CTO. This is where you're the go-to person for all things tech in your startup. It's typically a startup CTO, this one. The one who knows the code base in and out. Then as the company grows, somebody says, hey, you're the most senior tech person. You should be the CTO. I mean, it's a great opportunity, right? But now you're not just writing code, you're expected to lead a team, manage projects, align yourself with the business goals. And that shift from being a hands-on tech expert to a strategic leader is unnerving, to say the least. And when these CTOs come to me, they often have a really solid technical foundation, but very few frameworks for what leadership is about, or even what's expected of them in the new role. And they're kind of slightly lost at sea. The sort of opposite to that one is the seasoned technologist who's been waiting for the opportunity to lead for quite a long time. This person has been climbing the ranks. They've probably been excelling at every role they're at. And the difference here between the previous one and this one is that this person knows what the gap is conscious of it. And they often reach out to me knowing that this is a big step and that they're going to take it deliberately, but carefully. So they're often more aware of the chasm that I talked about earlier on than the other CTO types. The next one on my list is the plateaued CTO. Have you ever been in that situation where you felt like you're doing everything right, but the impact you have as a CTO is a lot less than you would expect? You're probably doing the role for a while. You're probably doing okay, but there's somehow something missing. Maybe you're struggling to break into the board level conversations, the influence. Maybe you're trying to shift from managing to leading, and you've hit a sort of a ceiling, or don't really have a clear roadmap to the next level. these CTOs often reach out looking for guidance because their executive presence is low and the tools to amplify their leadership is sort of missing. These kind of CTOs might talk about the feeling of a glass ceiling or a cliff to climb, and often some sort of established perception that they need to overcome in the rest of the organization as well, whether that's their own engineers or leadership in other areas of the business. And then finally, we've got what I call the rocket ship CTO. And this is basically where the company's taking off without them. The company's scaling fast, the growth is exhilarating but overwhelming. And suddenly you're managing larger teams, leader of leaders, you've got bigger budgets, there's more complex decisions with a bigger impact. And the leadership style that worked at the previous stage suddenly breaks beyond about 10, 20 engineers. And so decision-making speed and delegation becomes critical. The process maturity becomes important. And these CTOs often come to me feeling stretched thin. They really need some structure. They need some frameworks. They need to be able to keep up with the growth of their organization. And one of the other fears that they come to me, this one, is the sort of the fear of being replaced. Like the company's overtaken them so fast that they're going to get overtaken and then switched out for somebody else. So quick poll then, if you could just answer in the text chat. If one of these resonates with you, just type it into the text box. Take a quick poll to see which one comes up top. Yeah, some combinations. Awesome. So quite evenly spread amongst the first four. And then the rocket ship is the sort of the exception. It's one of those ones where everybody aspires to it, but never quite reaches it. They are quite rare. Cool. So this is a good way to sort of very quickly pigeonhole yourself and understand, where am I coming from? Why is it that I'm stuck? So what we're going to do next then is quickly move on to how can we get from where we are to where we need to be? And there's a couple of models that I'm going to go through now to help understand that, plot it, and then figure out where the gap is. And the first one is something that I've actually built over the last decade or so of leadership, and I call it the CTO maturity model. It's a 9-point area to understand where you are today versus where you need to be in a sensible time frame. And that could be 6 months, it could be 18 months. For a startup, 6 months is more relevant. For a more established enterprise with somebody who's leading leaders, 18 months is a more reasonable time frame. And so what I often find is that, if we just bring the pointer on the screen, the bottom left-hand corner is often an area of comfort for most technical CTOs. And then as we move away from that, that's where the lack of experience, lack of exposure tends to kick in, whether that's on the risk management and commercial knowledge side, whether it's on ops, DevOps, and management side. These are the areas with often a little bit of weakness, but still reasonably strong. And the places where the challenges are most are on these three on the far side: the leadership, the personal growth, and the team building. And the way that I get people to assess this, and you can do this yourself just using the titles. I've got a more fully fledged process which has a lot more detail behind each one of these things to help you. But essentially, the way it works is this: score yourself from 0 to 10 on each of these areas where you think you are now, and try and be honest with yourself, because it's that's the important thing. And then score yourself from 0 to 10 on where you need to be, where you believe you need to be in your future time frame. And the absolute scores don't matter so much. What really matters is the delta between those two numbers. And if you plot it on this kind of radial graph, what you'll find is you'll end up with a colored area that shows up the gaps where you probably need to cover more of ground to get to where you need to be. Now that is from your perspective. Where it gets really interesting is to then say, okay, CEO, my leader, my boss, whoever it is that you report to, where do they think you need to be in a sensible time frame, in the same time frame? And that leaves you then with two deltas: one between where you are now and where you think you need to be, the other one between where you think you need to be and where your leader thinks you need to be, and then of course the other one, which is between where you are now and where your leader thinks you need to be. Now those gaps form a good foundation for, number one, conversations to set expectations. And this is probably one of the biggest easy fixes that each of us can do to help with performance, is setting expectations. If we know what's expected of us, we know what we need to do. The second one is actually literally figuring out, okay, where do I need to go and level up? So how do we do that? I've got 5 steps in here, and it really helps to do these in this order, but it doesn't have to be. You can take this in any order. So the first one is generally aimed at the firefighter. Most people have some element of this, but if you don't have your diary sorted out, if you're not selective about which meetings you're in, if you aren't delegating well enough, you're going to struggle to actually get to some of the next ones, which is where you need to start delegating things out. Making fewer technical decisions, which is sometimes a little bit difficult to figure out. Is this a technical decision? Is this a leadership decision? Is this some other kind of decision? So if you can figure out how many of those technical decisions you can delegate to somebody else on your team, even if they get it wrong, is better than you taking the time to figure that out and being the bottleneck for those decisions. The next one is mindset. And that's shifting from I'm the victim, it's happening to me, I'm unable to sort out on my own, to I'm going to figure out how to do this. This is in my power and I can get there. And it's not always easy, this one. And this is where a coach really helps with this, whether it's a mentor within your organization, whether it's your CEO or somebody else. Then this is something that comes from Patrick Lencioni's 5 dysfunctions of a team concept, which is who's your primary team? A lot of CTOs feel as though their team is the engineers, is their leaders. And the reality is that whenever you're in any team anywhere, your colleagues are the people who are your peers at the same level as you. And as a CTO, your team is the CMO, the CRO, the CEO, the rest of the C-suite, right? And prioritizing those relationships and those deliveries is often more impactful, more effective than prioritizing the engineering team that you have. Doesn't mean to say that you abandon them. It's just about priorities. And then finally, and the most difficult one of all of these is learning the language of business. And this takes an element of time to get right, but understanding concepts like return on investment, like the difference between what is capital expenditure and what is operational expenditure, understanding the trade-off and risks and risk management. These are the kind of concepts and terms that the leadership team will speak in that an engineering leader doesn't necessarily have as a first degree language when they first enter into the leadership team. And it can be one of the reasons why there's this feeling of sort of being left out of decisions. How many of these resonate? Which of these feel most front of mind for those of you who are on the call?
Definitely freeing up time from my point of view. I spend far too much time in meetings. I guess probably the same for a lot of CTOs.
And meetings is one of those hard ones, right? Because there's a certain number of meetings that you have to be in, and then there's a certain number of meetings that you probably should be in. And then there's a number of meetings that you definitely don't need to be in, but it feels like it's more effective to be in them to not be in them. And those are the ones where you kind of have to be ruthless and sort of say, do I really need to be in every one of these stand-ups? Or can I get away with 2 out of 5 stand-ups, for example? Do I have to be in every ceremony of the team? Or can I get away with just doing 1 per week or 1 per sprint? Not always.
Yeah, stand-ups and those those ceremonies, they're quite easy to step back from because you can just check out Jira or whatever. But it's those technical discussions where you need to make sure that the decisions that are being made are commercially sensible as well as technically sensible.
Absolutely. Yeah.
You give an engineer a carte blanche and they'll do something that's really great and sexy and fantastic, but it's not commercially viable because it's going to cost a fortune. So those are the ones that are really hard to step back from.
Yeah, and it's that coaching approach to, okay, I'm going to delegate it to you, but these are the elements you need to think about, and here's how you go about thinking about it. And then trusting but verifying is another one that can help with that too. Definitely a challenge. Yeah. But it's all about banking the fires, isn't it? It's about freeing up your time, allowing your focus to be somewhere else than constantly in the tech and on the tech. as one of my mentors told me, it's about working on the machine, not in the machine, if you can manage it. Cool.
Yeah, I think for me, I would say just starting to realize you're part of the executive and not part of the technology team anymore is absolutely critical, because a lot of the times you can't have the attitude that, oh, this decision is being made and by a team outside of me, now I have to implement. You have to start to realize you're part of the team and you need to be part of the discussion and the decision making.
Absolutely. It's that being involved rather than it being delivered to you and handed back,
Yes,
isn't it?
exactly.
Thank you, Rob. Cool. So in summary then, it's these small leadership shifts, and each one on their own doesn't necessarily feel like it's a big change. And it's actually the combination and culmination of these over time as they compound that makes the biggest impact long term. And that's the bit that allows you to change your mindset as well. So everything from addressing your fears to filling in the knowledge gaps to identifying where a roadmap is going to make sense versus where a long-term strategy is going to make sense. But one of the earliest ones I would say is clarifying the role. As I said right at the beginning, is making sure the expectations are clear on all sides so that, as Rob says, you can be part of the exec team rather than reporting to the exec team. Cool. So one of the CTOs I worked with was struggling to balance the demands from both the direct reports and the leadership team. He was sort of in the middle of this tension, and he found himself under constant pressure, tackling really urgent issues and rarely making time to think ahead. And then through the coaching, he learned how, first of all, to delegate more effectively, to teach people the way he thought, to empower his team with more decision-making autonomy, and establish clear communication channels, when to communicate, how to communicate, and what to communicate. And this transformation gave him the breathing space he needed, just like Rob was talking about, to focus on that proactive leadership rather than reactive problem solving. And I'm happy to say that a year down the line, I'm still coaching him, by the way, his leadership growth has contributed to some really cool milestones. So he and his co-founder successfully closed a Series A just at the end of last year in a very difficult market, which is a brilliant win for them. They've also secured European-wide accreditations that they're a fintech. They can now sell all across Europe. And in addition to that, they've launched a major new product. So those achievements were initially, when I first started working with him 2 years ago, beyond his imagination. He really didn't think that that would be where he'd end up. And that then became reality with this sort of compounding approach to incremental improvements across his leadership approach. And it was his ability to step back, delegate effectively, and focus on the long-term strategy that transformed not only his role, but the company's trajectory. So from that perspective, I feel like the coaching was an investment that developed into a business advantage. So my question to you is, what's your next move? How are you going to step up into leadership and go where you need to go to? I'd love to take any questions anybody has.
Hi. So I've been part of a rocket ship with a CEO who's overbearing and always coming in with new ideas intra-week kind of interventions and, hey, this is a massive deal if we can just do this little thing and then, blah, blah, blah. We're going to close, a huge deal. And yeah, I've felt myself in firefighting mode, despite working on storytelling, despite having a presence in the C-suite and having some gravitas, despite, putting contracts in place about how we work together and, sort of defining boundaries and explaining the trade-offs of distractions and, not sticking to our plans, etc. So I'd love to dig into some sort of stories on your side around how you've handled that and, what advice you'd have for us.
Yeah, the best approach I've seen with that one, Ben, is to use what was called the CEO scoreboard, where one CTO I was working with had exactly the same challenge, a very confident, very product savvy CEO who knew exactly what they wanted and had the demonstrable success that made it quite difficult to refute them at times. And what he did was he basically used his own CEO's demands and requests against him. He literally had a whiteboard behind him on his desk, and every time he spoke to the CEO, he'd turn around and write the new request on the board before he did anything else. And then it'd say, great, where does this stack up against the ones that you've done previously? Because there was a list of there given over the last 3 months. And he said, brilliant. So this is number 9 on the list. Does it come above number 7 or above number 6? Because I definitely don't think it comes above number 5 because of reason. Do you agree? Yes, no. And then basically every time negotiated where it went into the list. And then he maintained what he called the red line. So the engineering capacity combined with estimation, combined with the trajectory, allowed him to basically draw a line and said, within the next 2 months, we're going to get to here. And that's where the red line went. And what he found was, and what he showed to the CEO was very often, in terms of impact versus effort, the newest suggestions coming in would fall below the red line. And it only took about a month of this. Actually, the month felt like a long time. It felt like a very long month before the CEO kind of realized where he was at and that he was basically being disruptive and the impact it would have if he was allowed to just dictate that to the team every time. So it was a slow version of education, but basically by using a whiteboard as though it's a mirror. Do you think that that kind of approach might be helpful for you in your scenario?
I think what really resonated with me earlier was when you talked about trying to apply logic to people who are profit and story driven. And I think that is a good plot device for kind of creating an emotion where otherwise I might apply logic directly and just try and construct an argument. I do think there's a sort of switching cost, right? There's a kind of context switching cost and a switching cost for everyone. And there's just an overall kind of pain to, replanning your week and pivoting on an opportunity. I think he has got that track record of that working for him in the early stages. And, I wonder if that whiteboard might still be somewhat logical and not story driven enough to kind of have an emotional effect on him and make him question his biases and sort of what's worked for him. But I think it's a good device.
Yeah, thank you. And I think the other attempt you can use as well is that old story of what got you here won't get you there. Because as you grow up and you have more teams and you have more problems running simultaneously, the chances of conflict and collision between ongoing works in progress means you've got to be more deliberate about teams to make sure they're running in parallel and not crossing over each other, not sort of running into each other as they go along. And it's a bit like going from fighting with one tank to fighting with a whole load of tanks. There's more chance of sabotaging yourself if your tanks are all running at different speeds in different directions on different tracks. And so something visual, very visual in terms of a refutement might help like that.
I've used that prioritization quite effectively in a couple of places. The one place I went into, and I was following on from a rocket ship CTO who had grown with the business. Everything had melted down. When I joined the business, they hadn't been able to deliver anything in about a year. And I found out what was happening was all the engineers, they were working really hard, but someone would come in and, someone from management or product management or whatever would come in and say, oh, I need you to have a look at this. This is really important. And they'd then get onto that, drop what they were doing. I spent about a week writing down a list of all the tasks that we had in the department. It was 135 of them. And we didn't have enough people to do that. So I sat down with the rest of the C-suite and got them to prioritize them. And every single one I said, okay, you can only have one priority number one. Anything else, no matter how important it is, if it's not more important than priority one, it's priority two. And we put that list down and I put financial values by each of those priorities. And then I divided it into 3, red, amber and green. The green, I said, these are things we're either working on or about to work on. The yellow is stuff that realistically we might be able to get around to. All this stuff at the bottom in red we'll never do. We haven't got resources. So you need to either bin it or add in some resource to bring it in. And when they saw that list, that gave them the visibility. Any new thing that came in, we say, okay, where does it fit in the list? Exactly as you described. And it would be, oh, this is really important. If only we had a green widget, then we could, this time next year, we'd be millionaires. Okay, is it more important than this? No. Actually, this thing you just came in really excited about is actually priority 26, and that's in the red zone. So should we just bin it now? So that visualizing it, giving it that putting it in that list, and I maintained it there for like 5 years.
Yeah, thanks,
Great
James.
story. Thank you, James.
I just say I did try that, and there was initial engagement with large lists, but very quickly people would just lose interest in that, find it overwhelming. That's your problem. You deal with your priorities. We're saying this is a big thing, and I think the emotional journey starts to kick in there a bit, which is what you mentioned earlier. To take people on that journey with the storytelling and be reductive. You have to be reductive, right? It's often too granular, I think, to present the true priority list.
Yeah. A shock tactic might work is to get a speech from somebody who's had a startup that's failed because of they trying to do too many things. Sometimes that can help if you end up with public or not public, but all company events where you can invite an external speaker in to give an instructive lesson in how not to do things. It can sometimes be a bit of a shock wake up call.
And the other thing you can say is, okay, you can have this. What don't you want?
Yeah. Cool. Rob's had his hand up for a moment. Rob, can we move over to you, please? Thank you, James.
Yeah, thanks. Apologies, I'm out walking the dog, but I love that CEO scoreboard that is visual. I'm gonna nick that if I'm honest. One thing I find that a lot of us struggle with is actually letting go of like the technology thing. And you briefly mentioned like touch points, things like that. And I'm curious, what practical advice do you have for what touch points should go in place to make sure things are still going well on the technology front so that you can actually let go?
That's a good question. So I think that this comes down to this, that you can trust but verify, and it's the verify aspect that becomes the challenge. And one of the things that I've used in the past is this concept of systemic communication. And by that, I mean using a system to communicate rather than relying on word of mouth, Slack messages, emails, etc. And so sometimes that might look like a roadmap on a Jira board, a burn down chart, something where you can look at those kinds of things and look at the implication. But ultimately, it comes down to delegating ownership to your leaders so that they understand that they're responsible not just for the delivery, but for the impact too. So they are responsible for putting in place a metric that will show what happens when this feature goes into live and that it has its effect. And then you use that as basically as a coaching point such that they can improve based on their impact on the metrics that count next time around, etc.
Oh, thanks. That's actually a really good idea, getting people to build the metrics themselves. And we all understand what's going to happen. Appreciate that. Thanks, Adam.
Very welcome. Cool. We also had a point from Maxim saying it was all very operational, but what about the strategic leadership? How does that come into it? And I think the key thing about strategic leadership is alignment. And if you have an engineering strategy that you can point to that is listed out or written out as a narrative, and you can go, okay, this aligns with the overall goals and will achieve the organizational objectives or the product objectives in these ways and in a time frame that's measurable by these things, then you have a strong alignment. If your CEO believes in your engineering strategy, then that's the approach to take. If the strategy gets derailed by the CEO themselves saying, oh, we're going to change direction 3 times a week, it becomes very hard to have a strategy that fits because there isn't an organizational strategy that fits other than chasing the latest thing, the latest idea, the latest fashion. And that's not really a strategy. So if your CEO isn't being strategic, I think it's very hard to be strategic engineering wise. Cool. Any other questions or any other points or comments from anybody else? We've had some really great conversations so far.
I think a lot of it is dependent on CEO. They define the culture within an organization. I've worked with CEOs who are really disruptive and destructive. So yeah, coming up with the new ideas or trying to change direction every week. So it was really daunting. So I'm lucky enough now in my role where CEO does give a lot of autonomy. We sort of have quarterly cadence of planning. So we set the goals for organization and we go and execute. And I try to, create autonomy for my teams, and that somehow works. Really depends on CEO. And now when I would be considering in your role, I would be really paying very close attention to the CEO and their style, whether I will be compatible, whether I'm going to enjoy to work with them.
That's a really good point. And I think it's something that a lot of people, especially in the current market, forego as a part of the decision-making process as to who to join as a company. Is this the right CEO and leadership style for me and my style? There is a sort of compatibility element there. I think one of the things that I've noticed amongst people recently, especially CTOs and CIOs joining organizations, is one of their decision-making processes, does the CEO have a coach? Because if they do, they're likely to have an improvement mindset. If they don't, it's often if not a red flag, then at least a warning and something to be aware of going into an organization.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I just wanted to reinforce that all the things I've said that didn't work in one context all worked in another, so, but I think just another question or statement is sometimes CEOs will push and push and push just to see how hard until you push back and how hard you push back, right? And sometimes they're just looking to see if they can get to that trigger point where you sort of thrash back and then they're like, okay, great, they're at their limit.
Yeah, and that can be uncomfortable to be part of, because it does feel as though you're being tested to destruction, and it feels like it's not really necessary at times. And sometimes that can be a character flaw, and sometimes it can be a deliberate test. When it's a deliberate test, it often occurs within the first 2-3 months of working with a new CEO. But when it happens continuously, it can get uncomfortable and disenfranchising. You can become sort of feeling disconnected because any efforts you have are always going to be questioned, always be pushed for more. I think quite a few of the CTOs I work with have ended up sort of setting their own sort of red lines, their boundaries. Once those are crossed, then that's when they start thinking, okay, am I in the right place? And talking to the CEO about whether they're in the right place or not.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it was being more comfortable setting those boundaries and, not seeing it as conflict, but seeing it as an opportunity to, to find ways to signal that we're hitting our limits without feeling too emotional.
Definitely. We've got another question here. So, do the strategic CTOs who delegate, outline constraints, create space for autonomy, and lead through their VPs get the reputation of being detached from engineers? I don't think that is a necessarily logical conclusion. I think the best CTOs end up being the bridge between the business and engineering. And so if a CTO ends up getting detached from either side, typically it is the leadership side, the executive side, rather than the engineering side. Have I seen CTOs end up being sort of more leader than engineer? Very rarely. I think it's something that you wouldn't accuse most CTOs of. In fact, it's the opposite in many cases. So I think there are occasions when engineering leaders who aren't the CTO feel as though they don't have the backing of their CTO, but I don't think that's quite the same thing as being detached. And again, that can be simply fixed with a good leadership roundtable and a listening approach. Being a good listener is one of those things that is surprisingly difficult and takes constant practice to get right. Thank you for that question. Anybody else have any other questions, or is it a good point at which to say thank you very much and leave people to have a bit of time to eat their lunch?
So a quick question for me, just around I guess it's that storytelling, or I've struggled in the past. You've got a plan, you're pretty confident it matches the business strategy. And you've got a plan that to you makes complete logical sense, but some reason it just doesn't quite seem to resonate, and there's a bit of a disconnect. And I've sort of tried various things. I guess I don't know any advice in that area around creating a narrative. I've sort of noticed if there's a plan going on that's very busy with lots of other stuff going on. In this particular case, it was a big divestment of a particular division out into a standalone company. And so there's this sort of tech plan in place that was going to support that. And I was trying to articulate in kind of board meetings, well, this is what we're doing, this is where we're up to, that kind of thing. And I could never quite decide if if I'm going into too much detail or not enough detail, or on reflection after I'd left the business, it was maybe that kind of assuming that anyone's actually read anything you've sent is probably, that's probably a bad assumption. And assuming that anyone remembers what you said in the last meeting may also be a bad assumption. So almost having to reinforce that message over and over again. I don't know, that was just I didn't have a chance to put that theory into practice. But yeah, anything in that area would be useful.
Yeah, I think you kind of gave the tip there when you said reading stuff that you've sent between meetings, because I think a lot of the time it's a little bit like trying to convince a jury when all you've got is the time to present to them as a group. Whereas really what you want to be trying to do is to build consensus and get that buy-in much earlier on than when you present it, such that the presentation should be the rubber stamp of a full buy-in, such that you've gone to each member of that executive team or leadership team, the decision-making committee, whatever it is, beforehand, and run your current thinking by them, listen to them, incorporate that feedback into the plan, double check it with them, and then repeat with each person in that team, so that by the time you present your solution, your outcome, your proposal to the team, everybody else can recognize their input into it. So it's been co-crafted and co-created. And then by definition, you've got buy-in from everybody and you move forward. Whereas if it's something you're delivering to them and saying, is this good enough? It's like handing in your homework and watching all the red squiggles appear on it where they're marking it. So I think it's that idea of co-crafting with the team so that the buy-in is built into your process from the beginning, so that there's no surprises, essentially. Is that a process that you recognize from where you followed or didn't follow?
Well, probably more the latter, as in didn't follow. And what you say makes complete sense. I guess the challenge of that is obviously getting people's time. So if, again, in this particular, just the context I'm thinking of, which is not unusual, everyone's super busy. So having that very kind of collegiate kind of approach and trying to speak to people beforehand, and it sounds great, but if there's not enough time, then you're sort of still with those, potentially with an hour a week, let's say, or an hour a fortnight even, it's trying to sort of build up some kind of narrative, something that people recognize.
Yeah.
And not, if you don't have a chance to speak to them one-on-one, which is
and I think it's exactly that. The two key phrases you said is building up and one-to-one. If you are constantly having one-to-ones with them, so you have those scheduled in the diary, even if they're only 15 minutes a fortnight, some way to touch base, ask how you can help them, contribute to their department, their outcomes, even just some of the challenges that they're having around communication, some of the easy stuff, then you end up with this sort of trust bank that you've got some sort of credit deposited into, such that when we need to withdraw from that and say, right, I need 30 minutes of your time, I need an hour of your time to discuss this major proposal and get your feedback on it, you've got that sort of trust in the bank, so you can get some time in the diary over some other priorities that they might have. And that is something where it's quite different from engineering, where we think, great, there's a logical approach, there's a hierarchy, I just put myself into the process works and it goes. That works in engineering and uniquely doesn't work around the rest of the business.
Yeah, good. Thank you.
This consensus building sounds like it's called nemawashi, and it comes from Japanese culture. So the idea is you go and you talk to people, you find their difficulties, you get their inputs, and you take a notepad and you write it down so they know you're taking their opinion. And then when it comes time to the presentation, you can say, hey, Mr. CFO, I thought about that thing you said, and so I was thinking of this strategy. And also, Mr. Salesperson, you were thinking of this as being a problem, so I also considered that. So even in your presentation, you can deliberately call out what they were thinking as something and show that you took their input, so that when you give that presentation, and as you say, that rubber stamping should happen because everyone's already happy with the decision, you're already have that mindset going along in that direction.
Thank you, Peter. That's really well articulated.
Yeah, so I put the name of what it's called in Japan. It's called nemawashi. I put that in the chat in case anyone wants to Google and read up on that.
Thank you.
Thank you. That's great.
I just wanted to go back on that storytelling piece. You know, disembodying it, making it about other people and other events rather than the current event definitely can take a lot of the emotional charge out. But similarly to the previous person speaking, Alex. I'm still trying to perfect it. Do you have any good resources you can suggest for us?
There's a really great book by an ex-US submarine Navy captain. It's called Turn the Ship Around. And it is literally the story about how he took this management approach of delegating accountability and authority into what used to be a very hierarchical, very top-down driven military organization. And he basically, the idea of Turn the Ship Around is that you basically ask everybody to say, I intend to, rather than what should I do? And the book is about all the different ways he tried to apply this within the Navy and all the challenges he came up against with the mentality, the approach. And it's it's a short book. You can read it over a weekend. It's quite instructive. And the principle is repeated again and again, so it sinks in very well. I think that's quite a good first step to getting to that idea of how you can change leadership leading up to you, and in turn, therefore, how you can do the same thing for your leaders.